Elvis set his guitar down on the worn linoleum floor of the tiny kitchen and looked at his mama with eyes that had finally run out of hope. It was March 12th, 1954, and at just 19 years old, Elvis Aaron Presley was done dreaming. He'd been rejected 17 times in the past 14 months, and he couldn't take one more person telling him his voice was too different, his style was too strange, or his future was in truck driving instead of music. This was the moment when the king of rock and roll almost never happened. The conversation that took place in that cramped Memphis apartment between a broken young man and his determined mother would change the course of music history, but neither of them knew it yet. All Elvis knew was that his heart couldn't handle another audition, another rejection, another disappointed walk back to his truck with tears burning behind his eyes. All Gladys knew was that her son had a gift from God, and she'd be damned if she let him quit one audition too soon. 3 weeks earlier, Elvis had driven to Nashville for what he'd promised himself would be his final attempt at a music career. The audition was for a spot on the Grand Ole Opry, the most prestigious stage in country music, and Elvis had practiced for 2 months straight, learning every traditional country song he could find, trying to sand down the rough edges of his style that everyone kept telling him were wrong. He'd borrowed money from 3 different people to afford the gas for the trip and the entry fee for the audition. His mama had sewn him a new shirt from fabric she'd saved for 6 months to buy. His daddy had polished his shoes until they gleamed like mirrors. This was supposed to be the one that worked. The audition lasted less than 3 minutes. The moment Elvis started singing, the director held up his hand and stopped him mid-verse. The words still echoed in Elvis's head 2 weeks later, keeping him awake at night, eating away at whatever confidence he had left. "Son, you got a nice voice, but it doesn't fit anywhere. You're trying to mix colored music with white music, and nobody wants that. Stick to what you know, or better yet, stick to your day job. Country music isn't for folks who can't stay in their lane." Elvis had driven the 4 hours back to Memphis in silence, his new shirt soaked with sweat and shame, his mama's careful stitching wasted on another failure. He'd gone to work the next morning at Crown Electric Company like nothing had happened, driving the truck, delivering supplies, pretending that his soul wasn't shattered into pieces too small to put back together. For 2 weeks, he'd avoided his guitar, avoided the radio, avoided anything that reminded him of the dream that kept breaking his heart. But what happened next stunned everyone. His mama refused to let him quit. Gladys Presley had watched her son get rejected over and over, had held him while he cried after auditions, had listened to him practice the same songs, hundreds of times, and she knew something that Elvis had forgotten in his despair. He wasn't being rejected because he lacked talent. He was being rejected because he had too much of it, and people were scared of what they didn't understand. On that March evening, when Elvis told her he was done, that he couldn't take another rejection, that he was going to sell his guitar and accept that music just wasn't meant for him, Gladys did something she'd never done before. She got angry. Not at Elvis, but at the situation, at the people who'd told her son he wasn't good enough, at the world that couldn't see what she saw every time she watched him sing. "Elvis Aaron Presley," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "you listen to me good. You're going to do one more audition, just one more. And if it doesn't work, then we'll talk about quitting." "But I didn't raise a boy who gives up one try too soon." Elvis shook his head, his eyes red from crying. "Mama, I can't. I can't handle them telling me no again. It hurts too much. Each rejection feels like they're telling me everything I am is wrong. I don't sound like the country singers they want. I don't sound like the blues singers they want. I'm just stuck in between, and nobody wants that." Gladys moved closer to her son and took his face in her hands, the way she'd done since he was a little boy. "Baby, the reason you don't fit is because you're not supposed to fit. You're not supposed to sound like everyone else. God gave you something special, something the world hasn't heard yet, and just because these people are too blind to see it doesn't mean it isn't there. You remember what I always told you? The darkest hour is just before the dawn. Well, baby, I think we're in that dark hour right now." Elvis pulled away, frustrated and exhausted. He walked to the window and stared out at the Memphis street below, watching cars pass by, watching regular people living regular lives, wondering if that was what he was meant for after all. Mama, maybe they're right. Maybe I should just stick to driving the truck. It's steady work, good money, and I don't have to feel like a failure every other week. Maybe trying to be different isn't brave. Maybe it's just stupid. But Elvis wasn't finished. The words that came next would haunt him for the rest of his life if he gave up now. Gladys's voice was soft but firm when she spoke again. "When your brother died," she said quietly, referring to Jesse Garin, Elvis's twin who had been stillborn, "I made a promise to God. I promised that I would raise you to use every gift he gave you, that I wouldn't let you waste a single talent. And baby, your voice is not a waste. Your music is not a waste. You are not a waste. So I'm asking you, begging you to try one more time, not for those people who rejected you, for yourself. For the little boy who used to sing on the porch and dream about being on the radio, give him one more chance." Elvis turned from the window, tears streaming down his face. "Where, Mama? Where am I supposed to go? I've tried everywhere. Nashville, the radio stations here, the local venues, everywhere tells me the same thing. I'm too different." "There's one place you haven't tried," Gladys said. "Marion Kiesker at Sun Records. Your friend Red mentioned she's been looking for new talent. She doesn't care about fitting into boxes. Sam Phillips, who owns the studio, they say he's looking for something fresh, something different. It might be worth a shot." Elvis had heard about Sun Records, the small studio on Union Avenue where blues and country musicians recorded. He'd even driven by it a few times, working up the courage to go in, but each time his nerve had failed him. It was one thing to get rejected by big venues and established places. It felt like it would be worse somehow to get rejected by a small local studio, like if he couldn't make it there, he really was hopeless. "Mama, if I go there and they say no too, that's it. That's the last one. I mean it. I'll sell the guitar and that'll be the end of it." Gladys nodded slowly. "Deal. One more try. That's all I'm asking. But you go in there like you mean it. Don't go in defeated. Go in like you're about to show them something they've never heard before, because that's exactly what you're going to do." But then something unexpected happened. The next morning, Elvis didn't go to Sun Records. He couldn't. Fear paralyzed him completely. He got dressed for work, drove the Crown Electric truck on his route, came home, ate dinner, and went to bed without saying a word about the promise he'd made to his mama. The same thing happened the next day, and the day after that. A week went by, and Elvis still hadn't worked up the courage to walk through the doors of Sun Records. Each day, Gladys would look at him with questions in her eyes, and each day, Elvis would avoid her gaze and find excuses for why today wasn't the right day. The truth was, Elvis was more terrified now than he'd ever been. This was the last chance his mama had asked him to take, and if it didn't work, then his dream really was over. As long as he didn't go, as long as he didn't try, he could still hold on to the possibility, however thin, that maybe he had something special. The moment he walked into Sun Records and got rejected, that possibility would die forever. So he avoided it, put it off, told himself tomorrow would be better, and watched another day slip away. On March 23rd, 11 days after the conversation with his mama, Elvis came home from work to find his guitar sitting on the kitchen table with a note attached to it in Gladys's careful handwriting. The note said simply, "Baby, fear is just another word for something that matters. If this didn't matter to you, you wouldn't be scared. Go tomorrow. Please. Love, Mama." Beside the note was $4 in crumpled bills, money Elvis knew his mama had scraped together from God knows where, and a small lunch she'd packed for him so he wouldn't have to worry about eating. Elvis sat at that table for 3 hours, holding the note, crying in a way he hadn't cried since he was a child. He cried for every rejection, every disappointment, every person who'd told him he wasn't good enough. He cried for his mama who believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. He cried for the little boy who used to sing into a hairbrush and dream about being on the radio. And somewhere in those tears, something shifted. The fear didn't go away, but something stronger rose up beside it. If he was going to fail, he'd fail trying, not hiding. The next morning, March 24th, 1954, Elvis called in sick to work for the first time in his employment at Crown Electric. He put on the shirt his mama had made him for Nashville, the one he'd sworn he'd never wear again, polished his shoes the way his daddy had taught him, and slicked his hair back with enough pomade to survive a hurricane. He picked up his guitar, looked at himself in the mirror, and barely recognized the terrified young man staring back at him. He looked like someone pretending to be confident, wearing bravery like an ill-fitting suit. But he walked out the door, anyway. Sun Records was a small, unassuming building on Union Avenue, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Elvis parked his truck across the street and sat there for 45 minutes, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't trust himself to hold his guitar steady. He watched people walk in and out of the building, watched the world continue, like this wasn't the most important moment of his entire life, watched the minutes tick by on his dashboard clock. At 2:47 p.m., he forced himself to get out of the truck before he could change his mind again. The bell above the door chimed when Elvis walked into Sun Records, and Marion Keisker looked up from the front desk where she was filing paperwork. She was used to hopeful young musicians walking through that door, used to seeing the mixture of desperation and dreams in their eyes. But there was something about this particular young man that made her pause. He looked absolutely terrified, but determined, like a soldier walking into battle knowing he might not come back. "Can I help you?" Marion asked, setting down her paperwork. Elvis cleared his throat 3 times before words would come out. "Yes, ma'am. I'm hoping to audition. I sing and I play guitar, and I know you probably hear this from everyone, but I think I've got something different." His voice cracked on the word different, betraying how much that word had hurt him in the past. Marion had heard those exact words hundreds of times before, usually from kids who had no idea how competitive the music business was, how many talented people never made it despite their best efforts. But there was something in this boy's eyes that made her curious. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elvis Presley, ma'am. I work at Crown Electric, but music is what I really want to do. I've been practicing for years, and I just need someone to give me a chance." "What kind of music do you sing?" Marion asked, already reaching for the standard test recording form. Elvis hesitated, and in that hesitation, Marion could see the history of Rejections written on his face. "I sing all kinds, ma'am. Country, blues, gospel, whatever feels right for the song. I know that's not usually how it works, that most folks pick a style and stick with it, but I can't help mixing them together. It's just how it comes out." And that's when everything changed. Marion's eyebrows raised slightly. She'd been working at Sun Records long enough to know that Sam Phillips, her boss, had been searching for exactly that kind of versatility, someone who could bridge the gap between the music styles that were kept so carefully separated. "Mr. Phillips isn't here right now," Marion said slowly, "but I can record a test pressing for $4. If he likes what he hears, he'll call you back for a real session." Elvis's heart sank. He'd been hoping to audition live, to show them in person what he could do, to somehow communicate through his performance that he was worth taking a chance on. But he'd come this far, and his mama's $4 was folded in his pocket. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I'd like to do that." Marion led Elvis into the small recording booth, a cramped space with soundproofing on the walls and a microphone that had seen better days. She handed him a pair of headphones and adjusted the equipment. "What are you going to sing for me?" she asked. Elvis thought about all the songs he'd practiced, all the traditional country numbers he'd learned to try to fit in, all the blues songs he'd studied to understand their soul. Then he made a decision that would change everything. "I'm going to sing what I feel, ma'am. No more trying to be what people want. Just what comes natural." He sang "My Happiness," a ballad that wasn't quite country and wasn't quite blues, but somewhere in between. His voice started nervous and shaky, cracking on the first few notes, but as he closed his eyes and forgot about the recording equipment, forgot about the 17 rejections, forgot about everything except the music, something happened that Marion Keisker had never quite heard before. His voice found a groove that was uniquely his own, a blend of the raw emotion from blues and the storytelling from country, mixed with something that sounded almost like gospel fervor. It was rough around the edges, certainly not polished, but there was an authenticity to it that was impossible to fake. Marion found herself leaning forward, listening more intently than she had to any test recording in months. This kid didn't sound like the smooth crooners that dominated the radio. He didn't sound like the traditional country singers or the established blues artists. He sounded like something entirely new, something that might be exactly what Sam Phillips had been searching for without quite knowing how to describe it. When Elvis finished the song and opened his eyes, Marion was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. But there was one more twist coming. "That was interesting," Marion said carefully, choosing her words. "Really interesting." Elvis felt his heart drop. Interesting was what people said when they didn't want to say it was bad. It was the polite version of rejection. But Marion wasn't done talking. "I'm going to be honest with you, Elvis. What you just did doesn't fit into any category I know. You're mixing styles that aren't supposed to go together. The country radio stations won't know what to do with you because you sound too much like colored music. The colored stations won't play you because you're white. You're in this strange middle ground that doesn't really exist in the music industry." Elvis felt the familiar weight of rejection settling over him like a heavy coat. He'd heard this speech before, in different words from different people, but always with the same message. "You're too different. You don't fit. Go home." He started to stand up, started to reach for his guitar, started to prepare himself for the walk of shame back to his truck where he'd probably cry for the 18th time over a music career that was never meant to be. But Elvis saw something no one else noticed. Marion was smiling. A small smile, but genuine. "Sit back down," she said quickly. "I'm not finished. Everything I just said about you not fitting anywhere? That might be the best thing about you. My boss, Sam Phillips, he's been saying for months that he wishes he could find a white singer who could sing colored music with real feeling, someone who could bridge that gap. I think you might be what he's looking for. I'm going to keep this recording and play it for him. If he wants to hear more, I'll call you. What's your phone number?" Elvis gave her his home number, his hands shaking as he wrote it down. Marion looked at the paper and then at Elvis with something like sympathy in her eyes. "Listen, I can't make you any promises. Mr. Phillips is particular, and he might hate this, but I think you've got something. It's raw, it needs work, but there's something real in your voice. Don't give up just yet, okay?" Elvis walked out of Sun Records that afternoon in a daze. He couldn't tell if he'd just experienced his 18th rejection or his first real chance. Marion had said interesting things, encouraging things, but she'd also made no promises, offered no guarantee, given him nothing concrete to hold on to except the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Sam Phillips might want to hear more. He drove home in silence, came into the apartment where Gladys was waiting with desperate hope in her eyes, and told her the whole story. She cried with relief that he'd finally tried, then with frustration that there was still no clear answer, then with determination that this was going to work out somehow. 3 weeks passed, then 4, then 5. Elvis went back to work at Crown Electric, drove his truck, delivered supplies, came home exhausted, and tried not to think about the phone that never rang. Gladys would check every day, asking if Marion had called, and every day Elvis would shake his head and feel a little more of his hope die. By late April, he'd convinced himself that Marion had been kind in the moment, but had probably thrown away his recording the moment he left. It had been another rejection, just delivered more gently than the others. What he did next became legend. On June 26, 1954, 3 months after his test recording, Marion Keisker finally called. Elvis was at work and Gladys took the message with shaking hands. Marion said that Sam Phillips wanted Elvis to come back in and try recording a song with some session musicians. No promises, no guarantees, just a chance to see if the sound in Elvis's test recording could be recreated and expanded. Gladys could barely contain herself when Elvis came home from work. She met him at the door with tears streaming down her face and the message clutched in her hand. Elvis called Marion back immediately, trying to keep his voice steady, trying not to sound as desperate as he felt. She explained that Sam wanted him to come in that Saturday evening to work with Scotty Moore on guitar and Bill Black on bass. They'd try some different songs, see what happened, see if there was anything worth pursuing. Elvis thanked her so profusely that Marion had to gently interrupt him to say goodbye. When he hung up the phone, he looked at his mama and said the words he'd been afraid to say for months. "Mama, I think this might be it. This might be the one." Saturday, June 26, 1954, arrived with the weight of every rejection Elvis had ever experienced sitting on his shoulders. He showed up at Sun Records at 7 p.m. sharp, guitar in hand, wearing the same shirt his mama had made him. Sam Phillips was there, a man with sharp eyes and an ear for talent that had already discovered some of the best blues musicians in the South. Scotty and Bill were setting up their equipment, professional musicians who'd played with established artists, and had no particular reason to think this nervous teenager was going to be anything special. They worked for hours, trying song after song, standard country tunes, traditional blues numbers, popular hits that other people had made famous. Nothing clicked. Nothing felt right. Elvis could feel the opportunity slipping away with each failed attempt, could see the patience wearing thin in Sam's expression, could sense Scotty and Bill losing interest in this experiment that wasn't producing results. By 10 p.m., everyone was tired, frustrated, and ready to call it a night. This clearly wasn't working. But the story didn't end there. During a break, when everyone was putting down their instruments and preparing to pack up, Elvis started fooling around with his guitar. He was just playing, not performing, not trying to impress anyone, just releasing some of the nervous energy and disappointment that had built up over the failed evening. He started singing "That's All Right," a blues song by Arthur Big Boy Crudup. But he wasn't singing it the way Crudup had sung it. He was singing it the way it felt natural to him, fast and playful, mixing in country-style guitar licks, adding his own rhythm, making it something completely different from the original. Scotty picked up his guitar and started playing along, matching Elvis's energy. Bill grabbed his bass and started slapping it percussively, adding a driving beat. The three of them jammed together for maybe 90 seconds before Sam Phillips came running out of the control booth with his eyes wide and his expression transformed. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "What was that?" Elvis stopped playing, afraid he'd done something wrong. "Just messing around, sir. Just playing." "Do that again," Sam said urgently. "Do exactly what you just did, but this time I'm recording it." They recorded "That's All Right" in one take, one perfect take that captured the sound Sam Phillips had been searching for without knowing exactly what it was. It was blues, but it wasn't. It was country, but it wasn't. It was something entirely new, something that would later be called rockabilly and would eventually evolve into rock and roll. When they finished, Sam played it back and everyone in that studio knew they'd just created something special, something different, something that had never existed before. Elvis sat listening to his own voice coming through the speakers, and finally, after 18 rejections and years of being told he was too different, he understood what his mama had been trying to tell him all along. Being different wasn't a weakness, it was the whole point. That's All Right was released on July 19th, 1954. Within days, it was the most requested song on Memphis radio. Within weeks, Elvis was performing to sold-out crowds. Within months, he was the biggest sensation in the South. Within 2 years, he was the most famous entertainer in the world. The boy who'd almost quit one audition too soon became the king of rock and roll. Years later, Elvis kept a small notebook in his bedroom at Graceland. In it, he'd written the names of every person who'd rejected him, every venue that had turned him away, every audition where he'd been told he wasn't good enough. Beside each rejection, he'd written the date he'd proved them wrong. The notebook wasn't about revenge or bitterness. It was a reminder that rejection doesn't define you unless you let it, that being told no just means you haven't found the right yes yet, that giving up one try too soon is the only real failure. Marion Keisker, the woman who'd recorded Elvis's test pressing and convinced Sam Phillips to give him a chance, said in interviews for the rest of her life that she'd known from that first recording that Elvis was special. "I heard hundreds of auditions at Sun Records," she recalled decades later. Most of them blended together, forgettable and generic. But when Elvis sang that day in March, I heard something I'd never heard before. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was him, completely and honestly not trying to be anyone else. That's what made it magic. Gladys Presley lived long enough to see her son become the most successful entertainer in history, but she never forgot those dark months in 1954 when Elvis had wanted to give up. In her later years, she'd tell the story of that March evening when she'd convinced him to try one more time. "I didn't know it would lead to all this," she'd say, gesturing to the screaming fans in the sold-out shows. I just knew my boy had something special, and he deserved one more chance to show it. That's all any of us need sometimes. Just one more chance. The guitar Elvis used for that test recording at Sun Records, the one he'd almost sold in March of 1954, remained one of his most prized possessions. He kept it at Graceland, displayed in a case with a small plaque that read, "The guitar that almost gave up." Visitors who toured Graceland after Elvis's death would see that guitar and hear the story of how close the king of rock and roll had come to selling it and accepting a life of driving trucks and buried dreams. Sam Phillips often told the story of that June recording session when Elvis had finally relaxed and shown what he could really do. The biggest talents are often the ones who don't fit into existing categories, Phillips would explain in music industry seminars for decades afterward. Elvis could have spent his whole life trying to become a traditional country singer or a traditional blues singer, and he would have been mediocre at both. Instead, he stopped trying to fit and started being himself, and that's when the magic happened. The story of Elvis's near surrender in 1954 has been taught in music schools, shared at motivational conferences, and cited in countless books about perseverance. It reminds us that the difference between success and failure is often just one more attempt, one more try, one more refusal to give up when everything seems hopeless. Elvis Presley was 17 rejections away from quitting completely. He was one conversation with his mama away from selling his guitar. He was 3 months of silence away from accepting that music wasn't meant for him. But he tried one more time, and that one more time changed the world. Today, at the Memphis Rock and Soul Museum, there's an exhibit dedicated to Elvis's journey from truck driver to king of rock and roll. The centerpiece of that exhibit is a reproduction of the note Gladys wrote to Elvis in March of 1954, the one that said, "Fear is just another word for something that matters." Beside it is a timeline showing all 18 of Elvis's rejections before his success at Sun Records, a visual reminder that every legend faces defeat, every icon experiences doubt, every person who changed the world almost gave up at some point. The $4 Gladys scraped together for Elvis's test recording became the best investment in music history, a mother's faith in her son translated into currency that bought not just a recording session, but an entirely new genre of music. Elvis never forgot that sacrifice, and throughout his career, he made sure his mama never wanted for anything. But Gladys would always say that the real gift wasn't the money or the fame or the success. It was watching her son realize that everything people had told him was wrong about him was actually what made him extraordinary. Elvis's story teaches us that the moment when we most want to quit is often the moment right before everything changes. The voice that said he was too different was the same voice that made him unforgettable. The style that didn't fit anywhere created a space where a whole new sound could exist. The rejection that almost destroyed him became the fuel that drove him to prove everyone wrong. The last audition before giving up became the first step toward changing music forever. And somewhere in that Memphis apartment in March of 1954, a mama who refused to let her son quit one try too soon gave the world the king of rock and roll.